Hello everyone, Sidewin here. Today I'm going to be explaining how you go about playing and especially building a fighter in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The fighter is probably one of the most played beginner classes in Pathfinder, in part due to a legacy from D&D. However, while it is very simple to play, the fighter can be a little confusing to build because there are a lot of different feat options, and the fighter has no subclasses. Thus, all of the feats are in one big list, and you kind of have to read and pick and choose based off what weapons you're using. I will be walking through each of these feats in groups based on the weapon used or the shield used. So now to start, I'm going to start with a little bit of vocabulary because this comes up whenever you're looking at feats. I do not always show these on the feats themselves. I focus on the feat's effect. However, before picking, you may want to check that on Archives of Nethys. So to start, Flourish is a trait that when it is on a feat or other ability means that that ability can only be used once per round. A press ability is usable only when you have a multi-attack penalty, and you cannot ready this action. So for instance, to use a press ability, you would have to, say, trip someone and then use it, because trip applies multi-attack penalty. A stance is a ability that you trigger typically with one action, and then it lasts until one of these conditions is met. That is, until you're knocked out, the encounter ends, or you dismiss it usually. Sometimes a stance can end when you no longer meet the requirements. For instance, some stances may say you cannot move while you're using the stance. If you move, then the stance ends. And once you take a stance, you cannot take another stance until one full round has passed. So if you take a stance one turn, you cannot change your stance the next turn. The turn after that, you can change the stance. Alright, so now I'm going to be talking about the base statistics of the fighter. These are somewhat unique in that they really show why the class is powerful. So to start, the key statistic is either strength or dexterity. If you're doing a melee build, you likely want to go for strength, although some builds may instead choose dexterity. If you're going ranged, you always want dexterity, because it determines your bonus to ranged attacks. You do not add dexterity to any hit you make. The fighter gains 10 plus Constitution HP per level. This is one of the highest in the game, and the fighter is probably one of the most tanky classes in the game. The only one which is likely tankier is the champion, because that is pretty much a designated tank class. Then, the fighter has expert in perception, fortitude, and reflex, which means that, generally, you do not have to focus so much on the skills attached to that, although you likely will because they are your class skills. Then, the fighter is trained in will, which means that sometimes the fighter can be susceptible to mental attacks, though those do not appear at low level. And then, acrobatics or athletics. You choose. Generally, if you're a melee fighter, I recommend choosing athletics so that you have access to the athletics options, because it's a strength-based skill and very useful for aiding your allies. The fighter is probably one of the best martial support classes in the game due to all of its different abilities which interact with athletics. The only ones which are likely better are the swashbuckler and the alchemist. Alchemist is more of a spellcaster, but yeah. Then, the last thing the fighter gets in this column is +3, plus intelligence, additional skills, which you can pick from the entire list. Your background will also generally give one. Then, over here are the weapon and armor proficiencies. So to start, the fighter is expert in simple weapons, martial weapons, and unarmed attacks. Despite the proficiency in unarmed attacks, making a fighter that focuses on punching people is usually not a good idea. If you're interested in that, look at the monk class before you try to build a fighter that does it, unless you're using some type of gauntlet athletic build. But the reason this expert proficiency is important for the fighter is because it means they have +2 to attack over every other class in the game. And this bonus lasts at pretty much every single level. So the fighter is generally effective regardless of what you pick, as long as you do not dump strength or dexterity, depending on whether you're a ranged or melee fighter. Then the fighter is trained in advanced weapons, one of the only classes that is trained in advanced weapons. So if you're using advanced weapons, like say butterfly knives, the fighter is likely the class you have to pick, unless you find some trick elsewhere. But that's a lot of feats in searching through the list. Then the fighter is trained in all armor, which means you can go with a heavy armor build, you can go with a light armor build. It's very diverse. And that's really the point of the fighter. Like, to be clear here, it's the most base effective class and the most diverse class. Thus, it can be kind of confusing. Before I get to this next section, I do recommend you start getting an idea in your head of like what type of fighter you're doing. This is so that you can look through these options and go, hey, does this fit? Or will this not interact with my build at all? Now, I'm going to talk about the feat Reactive Strike. This is given to all fighters, and it is also a fighter unique ability. It's pretty much the only class that gets this at level 1. Usually martial classes get it closer to level 5. Essentially, Reactive Strike makes it so that the fighter can make attacks of opportunity against opponents. This uses your reaction. And it's a very powerful ability in Pathfinder, more so than in 5e, because it just does more. It's triggered by more abilities. So whenever your opponent moves or leaves a square, you can reactive strike them. And whenever they use an object, same thing. The one roll that's a little irregular is that on a critical hit, you disrupt manipulate actions. Otherwise, it's mostly just you get an extra strike, which can be very useful. Then, another feat that the fighter is automatically granted is Shield Block. Essentially, it allows you, whenever you are being attacked, to raise your shield, even if you haven't used an action to do this, and to reduce the damage by the shield's hardness. This means that you essentially reduce the damage. So that can potentially make it so you take no damage. The general meta with this feat is to use it on strikes which are dealing lower amounts of damage, because larger strikes, as you can see here, can potentially break your shield and make it so that you're far less defended for the rest of the fight. You do not always have to use this ability when you're being hit, to be clear. You only get one reaction per round. So between Shield Block and Reactive Strike, you already are a pretty reaction-heavy class, and almost every turn you will probably be using your reaction. Now, I'm going to go on to the specific feats for different specialties, starting with shield users, because this is the one category that kind of has a lot available at level 1, because a lot of these feats are shared with the champion class and come from Knights of Lastwall, which is a adventure path that has about like 3, 4, 5 feats at level 1 that alter various things for classes like the Cleric, Fighter, and Champion. So the ones that come from Knight of Lastwall are uncommon, meaning you generally want to ask your GM to make sure you can pick them. So to start, the first feat is Agile Shield Grip. This takes one action to perform. It allows you to decrease the damage die of your shields, shield boss, or shield spikes to 1d4, and you get to add the Agile trait, reducing multi-attack penalty on all future attacks on the shield. If you reverse it, you take back the normal damage and lose Agile. The second one is Everstand Stance. This is one action and a stance. It makes it so that you're holding your shield with two hands, increasing the damage die of your shield boss or shield spikes by 1 step. So if you have 1d4 damage already, you increase it to 1d6. Then it also increases the shield's hardness by 2 whenever you're using the shield block action. making it so your shield is less likely to break and you can use it on attacks that are dealing greater amounts of damage. The final option is Reactive Shield. This allows you to use your reaction to immediately raise your shield. This gives you your shield's bonus to AC. Typically, that is +2, unless you're using a buckler. This bonus applies to your armor against the triggering attack. It isn't applied after, it's kept until your next turn. Now, I'm going to go to the weapon-specific feats. These are generally they're generally used for specific builds, so make sure that you have one of those builds before picking it. The first one is Snagging Strike. It takes one action, and it is for a free hand build. So essentially, you have at least one free hand. That can technically be a hand wearing a gauntlet if you're using that for damage. This ability allows you to attack a target within your hand's reach. That's typically 5 foot at level 1, but certain ancestries have abilities that increase it to, say, 10 feet. On a hit, you apply Off Guard until it moves out of your reach or the start of your next turn. Off Guard is -2 AC, and it allows any rogue buddies or swashbuckler buddies to deal precision damage, meaning that this is a very good supportive ability for level 1 and a martial. I highly recommend freehand builds for support builds. Then there's Point Blank Stance. This is a ranged only feat, and it is actually the only ranged specific feat at level 1. Most of them are for melee. So with Point Blank Stance, you use one action to enter the stance, as with most stances. Then, whenever you're using a ranged weapon with the volley trait, you do not take -2 penalty from attacking targets within the weapon's range. Because the way volley weapons work is whenever you're within the range, you typically take a penalty. Then, for non-volley weapons, you gain +2 circumstance bonus against any targets within the first range increment of the weapon. That's because non-volley weapons are usually shorter ranged. So this essentially allows you to use volley weapons in close quarters and to provide a base bonus for all other ranged builds. Then the last one is Double Slice. This is specifically for dual weapon fighting builds. So if you're using a sword and a knife, this is a weapon feat you really want to look at and consider. So the way this feat works is that you strike with a weapon in both hands. You have to be holding one in each hand. Both use your current multi-attack penalty against the same target. You cannot attack two people with the weapons at the same time. You are attacking one person. And if this is your second action, both strikes are made at a -5 penalty. If this is your first strike, it's at no penalty. Then, if your second strike is made with a non-agile weapon, then you take -2 on your attack roll because of a form of multi-attack penalty. This ability counts as 2 multi-attack penalty strikes, so your next attack would be at -10. If both of your attacks hit, you then combine the damage of the strikes and apply resistance and vulnerability once. If you have precision damage, it is applied only once, but fighters are less likely to have that come in. So generally, this is useful for allowing you to combine damage of attacks so that you can bypass resistance or vulnerability. It's much better against enemies with resistance, because vulnerability you want it applying twice if you can, because it's a bonus to your damage, whereas resistance you want it applying once if you can, because it takes away from your damage. Now this last set of feats is very generalist. You can kind of pick it for any type of weapon, except most of them are for melee only. So note that. So to start, Combat Assessment. This is a generalist feat that kind of relies on having recall knowledge skills. So that's things like religion or occultism. Arcana and nature are the main ones. So it takes one action, and during it, you roll a melee attack roll. This is just general, it doesn't change. It uses your multi-attack penalty if you have one. Then, on a hit, you get to immediately roll Recall Knowledge without spending another action. And if you critical hit, on your attack, then you gain +2 to your recall knowledge check. The target is then immune for 1 day to your recall knowledge. But if you succeed on the recall knowledge, you still get the benefits. For more information on recall knowledge, look at the Archives of Nethys page, because it is a semi-complicated ability. Then, the second option is Exacting Strike. This is 1 action, and you make your strike. If you miss, you gain no multi-attack penalty. This is basically the one you pick if you can't pick anything else. It can be useful if you're going to be attacking a lot of times, because if you're attacking a lot of times, you're probably missing a lot of times. But in general, it's just not that special. But if you can't pick anything else, it's a good, just grab it. It's not going to mess up any builds. It's not going to not work for certain builds. It works for everybody. Then, Sudden Charge is also an option. It takes 2 actions. In Sudden Charge, you stride twice, and if you end within melee range of an enemy, you can make 1 strike against that enemy without spending your 3rd action, leaving you with 1 available action. So this is very useful if you have a great distance to close to reach an enemy, and you deal big damage. If you're using, say, a dagger, this is going to feel far less useful than if you're using a high damage die weapon, such as, say, a battle axe. And it's very commonly used by barbarians. Then, the last option for level 1 fighter feats is Vicious Swing. It takes 2 actions, and in it, you make a melee strike. On a hit, you deal 1 additional damage die. It counts as 2 attacks for multi-attack penalty. So the way Vicious Swing works there is basically, if you have a longsword, you, by base, deal 1d8 damage. With Vicious Swing, if you attack with your longsword and hit, you then deal 2d8 damage. The additional damage die increases as you gain additional damage die as well. At level 10, the damage die increases, and it also increases again at a higher level, making it so that the feat scales. However, again, it's more useful for barbarians because barbarians generally want to make 1 attack. Fighters, on the other hand, you can easily make 2 attacks in the same time and have a higher chance of critting on 1 or both. But if you're making just 1 attack, Vicious Swing can be very useful. So that is all for today. If you have any questions or comments, I realized I misspelled stuff on the slides. Sorry about that. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the future.